Good evening, and welcome to Metro Focus. I'm Jenna Flanagan. The State of the Union is a high-pressure event for every White House administration, perhaps the most influential scheduled event of the year. Historically, presidents have used it to lay out their agendas and set the tone for their next year in office. But for President Trump, who often contradicts his speeches via Twitter, will he stick to tradition? More importantly, what are the things the president must say to unite a country at odds with each other? How will he use his bully pulpit? And will he try to unite the parties, or will he provide fodder for further division with a focus on shoring up his base? Here to give us firsthand accounts of what it will take for Trump to hit a home run Tuesday night is former Reagan speechwriter Clark Judge and former Obama speechwriter David Litt. Okay, so Clark, I want to start with you. What do you see as being the must-haves in this upcoming State of the Union address?
Well, the first thing is to keep in mind that he's already essentially done a State of the Union address. His address to the joint session of Congress early last year, early in his term, was effectively his own first State of the Union address. And we saw in it tremendous sense of his audience. He could not have gone, except maybe for tonight, into an environment, into a group that was more hostile. The Democrats were very hostile. Of course, Republicans, most of them were very enthusiastic. Some of them had strong reservations. Within 3 seconds of the opening of the speech, he had them on their feet cheering. So that showed a real sense of his audience. I don't know if he can do it again, but my guess is they're going to try, or something like that, that draws the audience together right away, makes it difficult to boo him. He's got a lot of objectives and of successes in the first year. I'd expect him to rehearse those. And we all know what they are: the rapidly growing economy, the tax reform. Some of the regulatory relief and that sort of thing. But I'd also expect him to portray do something to give the Democrats a sense that they win by negotiating with him and lose by obstruction. Because he has a large agenda ahead, including immigration reform. And it's clear that he both needs and wants the Democrats to be part of the deal. So he's going to try to, in one way or another, both by carrot and stick, bring them over to talking. We'll see how it works.
Well, David, I'd like to get your take on the speech, because a lot of what are President Trump's triumphs from his first year in office are also issues that Democrats are passionately, the base is very angry about. So what do you see as what the president needs to say in this speech, or not say in this speech, to bring Democrats along?
Well, I think the State of the Union is often analyzed in terms of style, but sometimes substance gets neglected. You mentioned many of President Trump's accomplishments, and he has accomplished some real things. But it's not just Democrats who disapprove of those accomplishments. A majority of Americans don't like the tax bill that passed. They're not happy with the healthcare repeal effort that went through Congress 3 times now and was, for the most part, unsuccessful. So the question is going to be whether President Trump acknowledges that he is in a historically unpopular position and tries to do something about it. I don't think that he's going to go out there and say, hey, my bad, I didn't mean to do that tax bill. But I do think that he could make overtures, not just to say, it would be great if Democrats agreed to do what I want, but to say, here's something that I will do that not just my base approves of, but that most Americans approve of. A good example, I don't think this is going to happen, but if Donald Trump were to get up on Tuesday night and say, I support a clean DREAM Act, I support letting dreamers stay here without holding them hostage for other demands, that would be a wildly popular position, and it would put Democrats on their heels a little bit. Again, I don't think that's going to happen, but I do think that that's the kind of thing that Trump would do if he was a little bit more politically strategic and politically savvy.
Well, Clark, now I want to go back to you, because there have been several State of the Union addresses where we've heard a president lay out these very grand ideas for things they want to get done, and they don't always come to fruition. And considering that we do have a president now who we have seen on several occasions has said one thing and then either tweeted the opposite or done the opposite, is there any concern that the president's going to stand before the entire nation and mean what he says?
Well, I think I have a disagreement both with you and the other speaker. I think the other speaker is probably about a month behind the events, because in fact, the president now has approval ratings that are identical or even above what his president, Mr. Obama, had at this time in his presidency. Mr. Trump has been coming up fast because of the resolve he showed in tax reform, because of the things he did on healthcare, and because of the debacle of the government shutdown that Mr. Schumer and Ms. Minority Leader Pelosi in the House engineered. So this is actually an auspicious time for the president. I'd also disagree with you on he says one thing, does another. I think, early in his presidency or during the campaign, it was said of him that his supporters took him seriously but not literally. His critics took him literally but not seriously. And I think that's continued into his presidency, as we saw with the immigration program he put out in the last 24 hours. He's been reaching out to the Democrats. Whether they'll reach back is quite a different matter. But again, as I said earlier, it'll be a bit of carrot and a bit of stick.
When it comes to a bit of carrot and a bit of stick, let's just say that the president's stick is not what we're used to with other presidents. So are there any things that he shouldn't do, places he shouldn't go?
I think what you'll find is that speeches like this, while he is very strong and very emphatic about his positions on issues, he is also, in many ways, something of a traditional president. You look at his major addresses, these have been well thought out, well crafted, very grounded in fact and in the moment.
We feel in a very divided space right now as a country. And I'm wondering, what are some of the subjects that the president could use to get the country together, to make us all feel, yes, let's move forward on this agenda?
Well, that's a good question. Before I address it, I do need to talk about something that Clark had said, because I think it's important. I think this is a good way of reflecting the moment that we're in, because I'm beginning to wonder, maybe we have two different President Trumps at this point. The President Trump that, as far as I know, in reality, has about a 39% approval rating. President Obama had about a 49% approval rating at this time in his first term. That's not an opinion that I have. That's just a fact. And similarly, President Trump's approval, by the way, has ticked up a little bit from about 36 to about 39. That is also a fact. I'm more than willing to live in this world where we have real facts. I'm not sure that President Trump is willing to acknowledge some of those facts, including how some of his own policies are playing out in the country. And that leads me to your question. I think that the issues that would make Americans feel better, you can ask Americans what would make them feel better. They'd feel better by huge margins if the president stopped using Twitter all the time. They would feel better by enormous margins if we were more respected around the world. They feel much less stable and much less secure because of a president who has, Twitter fights with a nuclear armed adversary.
I was going to say, is that really fair, though, to expect him to say, I'm going to stop using Twitter in the State of the Union?
We act as if it's a speech for President Trump to bring the country together. And I think it's very unlikely that he will govern differently now than he has over the last year. I think what's more interesting, if you're watching the State of the Union on Tuesday, is to figure out exactly how President Trump wants to speak to his base, how he's hoping, as Clark mentioned, to pressure Democrats into working with him or at least acceding to his demands. I don't know how you'd put it. But I think the idea that he's going to use the State of the Union to try to bring the country together, I wouldn't be looking for that. It just seems like a different president might be doing it. It certainly didn't happen with his speech last year, and it hasn't happened since.
We have 30 seconds left. So what is it that you're looking forward to the most to come from this speech?
I'd expect him to remind the country of the enormous growth we've had. We're now over 3% growth. That didn't happen during the Obama years. That's why the president's ratings exceed 45% now, about where his predecessor was at this time. And I'd expect a strong statement regarding the national security and how we'll be dealing with the year ahead.
All right. Well, listen, gentlemen, David and Clark, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and share your thoughts on what we might expect from the upcoming State of the Union. And we'd love to have you both back.
Thanks so much.